May 1945. The island of Okinawa lies under endless rain. Mud swallows boots, stretchers sink to their handles, and the smell of burned coral drifts through the night. Inside a canvas tent marked with a red cross, the light of a single bulb flickers over rows of motionless forms. A nurse's hands, gloved and trembling from cold, press fresh gauze against the side of a Japanese infantryman whose uniform is little more than torn cloth. He stares upward, expecting the blow that never comes. Instead, he feels warm water trickle across his lips. Around him, voices trade clipped English orders. Plasma up. Pulse weak. The rhythm of survival, not vengeance. Outside, the shelling has faded to a distant rumble. The nurse checks his bandage once more, adjusting it with the same precision she uses for an American Marine 2 beds away. She doesn't look for flags or insignia. Only bleeding, only breath. When dawn breaks, the wind carries the faint hum of aircraft over a landscape of ruin. But within that tent, the war pauses, replaced by the quiet discipline of mercy. By mid-1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most punishing chapter. The Allied advance that began at Guadalcanal in 1942 had clawed its way through jungles, reefs, and volcanic ridges, consuming entire divisions in the process. Each island captured pushed Japan closer to its home shores, but at a cost measured in lives and exhaustion. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had perfected the science of amphibious warfare, yet every landing was a descent into chaos. And nowhere did that chaos test American ethics more than in the treatment of enemy wounded. Before the war, the United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war. Its clauses were clear: all wounded combatants, regardless of nationality, were entitled to medical attention. But the Pacific Campaign exposed how distant treaties could feel amid heat, rot, and hatred. Japanese soldiers were trained under the Bushido-inspired belief that surrender was dishonor. Captivity, they were told, meant torture or death. Propaganda leaflets warned them never to fall into Allied hands. On the other side, many Americans, hardened by atrocities in China and the Philippines, saw the enemy as fanatical and merciless. When the first Japanese prisoners were taken at Guadalcanal in late 1942, they arrived dehydrated, delirious, and terrified. U.S. medics, guided by protocol, treated them anyway. Morphine for shock. Sulfa powder for infection. Water and rations divided equally with Allied wounded. Word of those moments spread quietly through Marine lines. Astonishment that men who had ambushed their friends were now lying under American bandages. Yet the acts continued, not out of sentiment, but duty. The Red Cross emblem on a medic's helmet carried meaning that transcended language. Behind the front, the medical system had become a vast machine. Battalion aid stations crouched just behind the firing line, dug into craters or shielded by palm trunks. Litter bearers ferried casualties along muddy trails toward field hospitals, where surgical teams worked by generator light. From there, hospital ships, white-hulled sanctuaries painted with broad red crosses, carried the wounded to base facilities on islands like New Caledonia, Espiritu Santo, or later Guam. Each link in this chain represented a promise that organized compassion could survive mechanized war. Still, the system strained under its own weight. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles. Blood plasma spoiled in the heat. Nurses slept in damp quarters, their uniforms perpetually stained with iodine. Yet they upheld a principle ingrained from training: every patient counts. For many, this neutrality was not abstract. It was personal. Letters from home reminded them that mercy distinguished civilization from destruction. As the war tightened around Japan, the number of captured or surrendered soldiers began to rise. At Saipan and later Iwo Jima, hundreds of wounded Japanese emerged from caves after days without water. Some still clutched grenades, expecting mockery or execution. Instead, They found surgical wards staffed by women in khaki and white, administering plasma through trembling hands. Reports from the field noted their disbelief, men bowing awkwardly, some refusing food until convinced it was not poisoned. These scenes revealed a strange symmetry: the same medical instruments, the same antiseptic smell, serving both conqueror and conquered. It was an inversion of wartime logic. American nurses, many only in their early 20s, faced their sworn enemy across the narrow space of a cot and made an ethical choice each time: to heal rather than hate. That doctrine was moral in theory, but it demanded infrastructure in practice. Behind every act of mercy lay logistics: sterilizers, plasma units, surgical kits, and supply convoys that threaded the Pacific like arteries. Maintaining them required constant coordination between Army and Navy medical commands. By 1945, this system had matured into a disciplined network stretching from the front lines to California. The tent on Okinawa, the one where an exhausted nurse steadied a Japanese soldier's breath, was not an anomaly. It was the endpoint of an entire architecture of care that had survived typhoons, shellfire, and bureaucracy. Yet it remained fragile. For every patient treated, hundreds more waited in caves or on beaches, and every act of compassion risked backlash from those who had seen too much death to forgive. But the system held, and because it held, moments like that tent scene were possible at all. Across the Pacific, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps formed the backbone of wartime medical care. By 1945, nearly 60,000 American nurses were serving worldwide, about a third of them in the Pacific Theater. Their duties stretched from makeshift field stations under fire to fully equipped general hospitals far behind the lines. They lived under blackout curtains, worked in monsoon humidity, and endured air raids that tore open the canvas above operating tables. Yet their mission never changed: to preserve life wherever possible. The Pacific battlefield was unique in scale and isolation. Casualties often occurred far from surgical facilities, forcing innovation in how the wounded were evacuated. Combat medics and Navy corpsmen became the lifeline. They crawled through smoke and coral dust to reach fallen men, carrying morphine syrettes taped to their helmets, sulfa packets in breast pockets, and small red crosses painted on their armbands. Their creed was identical to the nurses who waited behind them: the wounded first, regardless of nationality. When Japanese soldiers were found alive, rare given the no-surrender ethos, they received the same triage: airway, bleeding, shock. Once stabilized, evacuation began. Stretcher teams maneuvered through mud and shattered terrain toward field hospitals, clusters of tents holding surgical wards, supply depots, and wards for both Allied and enemy wounded. Inside, the air smelled of carbolic acid and sweat. Instruments boiled in kettles. Surgeons worked bare-chested in the heat, with nurses standing beside them counting sponges and handing clamps. Under the roar of generators, plasma dripped rhythmically into arms that had fired upon them days earlier. The lines blurred. The wounded were simply patients now. Beyond the beaches floated an unmistakable symbol of neutrality: the hospital ship. Vessels like the USS Solace, USS Comfort, and USS Mercy carried hundreds of beds, operating rooms, X-ray units, and pharmacies within their white-painted hulls. Marked with towering red crosses illuminated at night, they operated under the strict protection of the Geneva Convention. Aboard these ships, Japanese and American wounded often lay side by side, separated only by language. Records show nurses tending to enemy patients with the same routines: temperature checks, morphine doses, clean bandages. The atmosphere was disciplined, almost reverent. The sea's calm isolation amplified every human sound: breathing, footsteps, whispered thanks translated through interpreters. On land, permanent base hospitals followed the advance. Saipan's 148th General Hospital, Guam's Navy Hospital No. 18, and Leyte's 21st General Hospital became hubs for the recovery pipeline. They introduced new antibiotics and surgical protocols that saved thousands. By late 1944, penicillin, once experimental, was flowing from American factories in unprecedented quantities. Combined with blood plasma and sulfa drugs, it turned infections that once meant death into survivable wounds. Survival rates for abdominal and chest injuries rose dramatically, creating a new optimism in military medicine. Even the most skeptical soldiers began to believe that reaching a medic alive meant a genuine chance to live. But the system was not without friction. Cultural barriers persisted. Many Japanese captives refused treatment initially, fearing hidden motives. Some attempted suicide rather than accept care from the enemy. Nurses and interpreters learned to work with gestures, offering food first, water second, until fear gave way to exhaustion. Reports from the U.S. Army's Surgeon General noted that psychological shock among enemy patients often outweighed physical injury. Compassion itself became a form of therapy, undoing years of indoctrination that depicted Americans as monsters. This care extended even to civilians caught in the crossfire. In Okinawa, tens of thousands of locals, women, children, and elderly were treated in U.S. military hospitals alongside Japanese soldiers. American medical staff documented scenes of families reunited around hospital beds, unsure whether to bow or speak. The Red Cross facilitated these humanitarian overlaps, ensuring supplies reached all parties when possible. The neutrality of medicine began to erode the walls of propaganda. Behind the scenes, logistics determined Mercy's reach. Every tourniquet, every vial of penicillin depended on convoys threading the Pacific. Hospital ships replenished at Ulithi Atoll. C-47 transports ferried plasma from Hawaii. Mobile surgical teams rotated between islands. Even amid typhoons and kamikaze threats, the flow continued. The U.S. Medical Corps had become an invisible empire, one of gauze and steel carried by the will to restore what war destroyed. By the time the Okinawa campaign reached its height, this machinery of compassion was at full stretch. Tens of thousands of wounded Allied and Japanese moved through its channels each month. Within it worked nurses who no longer distinguished sides, only degrees of suffering. Their professionalism turned abstract ethics into living proof that decency could survive total war. It was within this structure that the story of mercy between enemies unfolded. Acts so small they seemed inconsequential, yet powerful enough to echo beyond surrender. Compassion amid the ruins. In the shattered landscapes of the Pacific, the war's most human stories rarely appeared in dispatches. They unfolded quietly, inside tents thick with the scent of antiseptic and rain. Japanese soldiers, brought in half-conscious from collapsed caves or burned pillboxes, would awaken beneath unfamiliar canvas ceilings to the murmurs of English voices. Some tried to rise, still convinced that capture meant humiliation, but instead of punishment, they found a nurse's hand pressing them gently back to the pillow. For many of these men, it was the first time they had been touched without violence since leaving home. Their disbelief wasn't only cultural, it was existential. Propaganda had taught them Americans were devils, that surrender led to dismemberment or experimentation. Yet here, water was offered in a metal cup, and morphine soothed agony without cruelty. Nurses often recorded the same reaction: silence, followed by tears. The enemy's pain was no longer abstract, it was immediate and fragile. Those moments changed the caregivers, too. The nurses who wrote letters home rarely mentioned heroics. Instead, they described the look in a patient's eyes when fear dissolved into confusion, or the trembling gratitude of a man who could barely whisper, "Arigato." Compassion had become resistance to the brutality surrounding them, proof that war's machinery couldn't erase empathy. Rescuing the dying under fire. Compassion, however, began far before the hospital tent. It started at the front line, where medics and corpsmen crawled through the chaos with only minimal protection. Their insignia, a small red cross on a white armband, offered no guarantee of safety. On islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima, sniper fire often cut down medics as they tried to drag casualties to cover. The unwritten rule was simple: everyone within reach, friend or foe. In one recorded incident on Iwo Jima, a Navy corpsman pulled 2 Japanese soldiers from a trench after spotting their movement through smoke. Both were severely burned. He treated them with the same morphine and sulfa powder used on his unit, later handing them off to the field hospital before returning to the line. His report made no distinction of allegiance, just 3 wounded evacuated. The American evacuation chain was designed for speed. Within minutes of being found, a casualty could receive plasma, be carried to a field dressing station, and then transported by amphibious tractor or jeep to a surgical site. This efficiency saved thousands, but it also ensured that the few Japanese prisoners who survived capture would receive identical care. Ironically, the same logistical excellence that crushed the Japanese military machine also preserved the lives of its defeated soldiers. Each rescue blurred the edges of enmity. Medics spoke afterward of realizing how small the difference was between uniforms once blood had soaked them the same color. Under the roar of battle, the decision to save an enemy life wasn't philosophical. It was procedural. But the act itself planted seeds of conscience that would outlast the war. The tools that defied death. World War II transformed medicine as profoundly as it transformed warfare. By the time American nurses treated Japanese wounded in 1945, they were using tools that had been science fiction only 5 years earlier. Sulfa drugs introduced in the late 1930s had already reduced infection rates dramatically. Then came plasma transfusions, portable life in glass bottles, delivered through tubing that swayed gently in the tense heat. But the true miracle was penicillin. Mass-produced for the first time in 1944, it revolutionized battlefield medicine. Infections that once killed within days were now manageable. The United States produced millions of doses, flown across the Pacific in refrigerated containers. For the nurses and doctors on the front lines, penicillin was a symbol of hope, a tangible difference between old wars and new. Technology gave compassion endurance. Where once a nurse could only comfort the dying, she could now bring them back. Japanese prisoners who expected amputation often left hospital wards with their limbs intact. The experience shattered their perception of Allied cruelty. One Japanese diary recovered after the war described an American nurse who smiled like spring after the storm, an image that haunted its writer more than the defeat itself. Every vial, every sterile needle, was part of a moral arsenal. It proved that scientific progress could serve mercy as effectively as it served destruction. In a war defined by industrial killing, the instruments of healing became a quiet counterbalance, a reminder that not all innovation belonged to the battlefield. These 3 angles, human, tactical, and technological, interlocked to form a strange paradox. The same system that perfected killing also perfected saving. Compassion wasn't improvised, it was engineered, trained, and supplied. Yet its effects were always personal, rippling through individuals on both sides who carried the memory long after the shooting stopped. Orders that protected humanity. Behind every act of mercy stood a line of written directives. The United States Military Command understood early in the Pacific Campaign that the treatment of enemy wounded would define America's moral standing as much as its battlefield victories. The War Department issued clear instructions to all field medical units. Prisoners of war were to receive the same medical attention as our own troops, without discrimination. Compliance wasn't optional. It was part of the professional code that separated a lawful army from vengeance-driven militias. Medical officers who violated those standards faced severe penalties. The policy extended to hospital ships, which operated under strict neutrality. The USS Solace and USS Benevolence, among others, followed protocols forbidding the transport of ammunition or armed guards aboard. Every porthole light was shielded. Every deck watch drilled in signal recognition to prevent attacks. Commanders knew that protecting the sanctity of the Red Cross emblem preserved America's credibility even amid total war. This discipline reached all levels of leadership. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters distributed circulars reminding officers that humanitarian conduct wasn't weakness but strategy, an investment in post-war reconstruction. The Japanese would eventually need to believe that surrender could mean survival, not annihilation. Every rescued soldier, every bandaged prisoner, became an unspoken ambassador for that idea. Compassion wasn't sentiment, it was policy, designed to shorten the war by eroding the myth of Allied cruelty. When propaganda collapsed for the Japanese soldier, defeat was supposed to erase dignity. From the first days of training, recruits were told that capture was worse than death. Tales circulated of Americans mutilating bodies or turning prisoners into slaves. These fabrications hardened resolve in battle, but they also magnified the shock of reality once capture occurred. When wounded Japanese soldiers were brought into American hospitals, many resisted treatment. Some spat or refused food, convinced poison waited inside. Interpreters struggled to reassure them, often assisted by Nisei soldiers, Japanese Americans serving as translators in the Military Intelligence Service. Gradually, action spoke louder than words. The same hands that had fired rifles now stitched wounds, changed bandages, and offered soup. The contradiction broke something deep within indoctrination. Reports from intelligence officers note how these experiences created ripple effects. Recovered prisoners spoke of kind American nurses, a phrase that circulated quietly through remaining Japanese forces. For some, it planted doubt. If the enemy was capable of mercy, perhaps surrender wasn't dishonor. Even when not articulated, that shift weakened the psychological armor of fanaticism. One after-action report from Saipan recorded an officer who, upon realizing he would be treated rather than executed, began crying uncontrollably. His interpreter described it as a grief not for his wounds, but for the years of lies. Such encounters revealed that compassion could achieve what bombs could not, dismantling myth. In that sense, a nurse's steady hand became as strategically effective as a rifle company's advance. The oath that outlasted orders. For the American nurses themselves, the war was a test of principle. Their professional oath, to preserve life and alleviate suffering, was universal. Yet each new island challenged it. They faced men who had fired on hospital ships, who had ambushed stretcher-bearers. Some had witnessed comrades killed under white flags. The question arose quietly in conversations. Do they deserve it? Most answered through action, not words. Medical ethics demanded impartiality, and discipline enforced it. The Army Nurse Corps manual reminded them, a nurse does not choose her patients. What began as doctrine evolved into conviction. Compassion became a shield against moral corrosion. Cultural distance made this harder. Language barriers reduced communication to gestures, but tone and touch transcended it. When a nurse cooled a fevered brow with a damp cloth, she wasn't forgiving the war, she was refusing to let it dictate her humanity. Many nurses later admitted that treating Japanese soldiers was the most difficult duty they performed, not because of fear, but because it forced them to separate individual pain from collective guilt. The work reshaped them. After the war, many veterans of the Pacific Nurse Corps described those encounters as moments that redefined what victory meant. Saving an enemy life, they realized, didn't diminish the cost of war. It clarified it. The tented wards of the Pacific had become unlikely sanctuaries where civilization proved it still existed, even when everything else was burning. By the end of these intersecting angles, leadership enforcing morality, propaganda dissolving under compassion, and ethics surviving destruction, the war's narrative gains new texture. It was not only a clash of weapons, but a confrontation between ideas of what humanity itself meant. And as Okinawa descended into its final blood-soaked weeks, those principles would face their greatest trial yet, where compassion met chaos under unrelenting fire. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, and quickly became the most brutal confrontation of the Pacific War. The island, just 60 miles long, turned into a labyrinth of fire. By May, the skies trembled with constant bombardment, and the beaches had become charnel fields. Yet amid that devastation, American medical units advanced step by step, setting up aid stations within earshot of artillery. Every ridge captured brought new waves of wounded, American and Japanese alike. For medical personnel, Okinawa represented the breaking point of endurance. The rains turned trenches into rivers. Stretchers sank in mud. Plasma froze in the cold wind before reaching the patient. Tents collapsed under shell fire and were rebuilt before the smoke cleared. Inside these fragile sanctuaries, nurses and corpsmen confronted a scale of suffering they had never seen. Over 12,000 Americans would die on Okinawa, and more than 70,000 Japanese soldiers perished. But thousands more, bleeding, delirious, half-starved, lay between life and death, waiting for anyone to claim them. When the first groups of Japanese prisoners arrived, they were carried in by American litter teams who had found them among the dead. Most were too weak to resist. They arrived covered in ash, uniforms shredded, eyes hollow. Their wounds told of close combat, grenade fragments, bayonet thrusts, and burns from flamethrowers used in cave clearings. For the nurses waiting inside the medical tents, these men were the very embodiment of the enemy they had been warned about. Yet when they began to treat them, instinct replaced ideology. Reports from the 96th Division's field hospital describe one night in late May when a convoy brought in more than 200 wounded, half American, half Japanese. The triage officer made no distinction. Beds were filled in the order of urgency, the worst first. Nurses worked 12-hour shifts, often longer. Their movements became automatic: cut away clothing, irrigate wounds, insert plasma needles. Some patients cried out in English, others in Japanese. The noise was one unbroken current of human suffering. Outside, kamikaze attacks still rained fire onto nearby beaches. One explosion tore through a supply tent, scattering morphine vials into the mud. Yet within minutes, the staff resumed their work. The wounded couldn't wait for silence. When electricity failed, nurses used flashlights held between their teeth while stitching wounds. The rhythm of their actions, steady, methodical, became a defiance of the chaos outside. Among the patients was a young Japanese conscript, barely 18, found unconscious in a hillside bunker. His injuries were severe: shrapnel across his chest, a broken arm, and second-degree burns. He woke under a canvas roof, staring into the face of a nurse adjusting his oxygen mask. Later reports noted his confusion, his disbelief that an American woman was saving his life instead of ending it. His tears startled the entire ward. They were not from pain, but from shock. A translator later recorded his words, "I thought mercy was a lie." That moment was repeated hundreds of times across the island. POW wards began to expand, their cots filling with men who had once sworn to die before capture. The American nurses learned to identify symptoms of trauma not only from wounds, but from surrender itself. Many Japanese soldiers refused to meet their caregivers' eyes, convinced they were living on borrowed time. The nurses responded with small acts, offering food slowly, adjusting pillows, or simply sitting beside them in silence. Humanity spoke through presence when language failed. By June, Okinawa's hospital ships were overwhelmed. The USS Comfort anchored offshore, its decks crowded with stretchers stacked too high. Japanese and American casualties were loaded side by side. The nurses on board worked without sleep, moving from cot to cot as the ship rolled in rough seas. The smell of antiseptic mixed with diesel fuel and salt. Even when sirens warned of possible kamikaze attacks, few left their posts. They had learned that their patients, enemy or ally, had nowhere else to go. As the battle dragged on, compassion itself became a form of endurance. Nurses wrote in diaries later recovered by the Army Medical Department. "We treat whoever comes through the flap. We can't ask who fired the bullet. The wound is all that matters." That simple creed became a moral compass in a landscape where everything else blurred. Okinawa's final weeks tested that compass to breaking. The hospitals operated on cliffsides under near-constant shell fire. At night, tracer rounds drew lines across the sky, and the thunder of naval guns echoed through the hills. Yet the tents remained lit, small pockets of order within destruction. Patients who survived described them as islands of light. In one of those tents, under rain and flickering bulbs, a U.S. nurse adjusted the bandages on a Japanese sergeant who had been shot through the leg. He whispered something through cracked lips. His interpreter later said it was, "Thank you for not hating me." She didn't respond, only tightened the knot and moved to the next cot. There was no need for words. The act itself was answer enough. Outside, the guns still roared. Inside, mercy persisted, fragile, steady, undefeated. The greatest test of this compassion came not from exhaustion, but from danger itself. Hospital ships, protected under international law, became floating targets in the maelstrom of Okinawa. The sky above the anchorage shimmered with smoke trails as Japanese pilots, desperate and doomed, hurled their planes toward any vessel in sight. In April 1945, the USS Comfort, one of the Navy's largest hospital ships, was struck by a suicide plane during the night. The aircraft tore through her white-painted hull, ripping open the surgery ward. 28 medical personnel were killed, including 6 nurses. Dozens more were wounded. The incident sent shockwaves through every medical unit across the Pacific. The Red Cross, symbol of neutrality, had been violated. Yet the reaction was not retaliation. It was resilience. Within hours, surviving nurses resumed operations in other wards, stabilizing their own injured colleagues alongside enemy patients. Witnesses described the surreal sight, operating tables splattered with blood and seawater, yet the procedures continued under lantern light. They refused to let the idea of mercy sink. For those on land, the story reached the tents by radio. It became both warning and inspiration. The nurses on Okinawa knew the risks. They had already endured artillery near misses, collapsing wards, and disease. But hearing of the Comfort's loss crystallized their mission. To stop caring was to admit the war had claimed more than lives. It had claimed principles. So they carried on. June 1945 brought the typhoon season, drenching the island in relentless rain. The battlefield turned into a swamp of decay. Flies thickened around the dead. Dysentery spread among the living. Yet medical tents kept their lamps burning. Many were staffed by teams that hadn't slept more than 3 hours in a week. Morphine shortages forced rationing. Surgeons reused gauze after boiling it in buckets. Still, the wounded arrived, Japanese civilians, soldiers, and Marines alike. One after-action report from the 10th Army's Medical Department recorded an astonishing statistic. In the final 3 weeks of combat, nearly 2,000 Japanese prisoners were treated in Allied hospitals. Some were later transferred to rear area facilities on Guam and Saipan for long-term recovery. Among them were officers who had once sworn never to surrender. Now they lay quietly under American blankets, tended by nurses whose faces they would remember for the rest of their lives. Eyewitnesses spoke of a strange transformation taking place in those wards. Fear gave way to confusion, then to humility. Japanese soldiers began to assist orderlies in feeding weaker comrades. A few tried to communicate gratitude, bowing awkwardly from their cots. Nurses recorded the change in their journals. At first they turned away. Now they meet our eyes. Compassion had become contagious, but it was not without emotional cost. Many caregivers struggled privately with grief and anger. They had seen friends die in kamikaze blasts or drown in flooded trenches. Treating the enemy sometimes felt unbearable, yet discipline carried them through. The Army Nurse Corps had instilled in them a singular identity. You're not here to judge, you're here to heal. That simple creed anchored them when fatigue threatened to hollow out empathy. By late June, the guns on Okinawa fell silent. The Japanese commander, General Ushijima, committed ritual suicide, ending organized resistance. When the ceasefire spread across the island, the hospitals did not celebrate. They simply kept working. The last wounded trickled in, men found in caves, delirious and skeletal. Some were treated, others buried. And then, at last, the war on Okinawa ended. What remained were the tents, flapping in the wind, floors layered with mud and memory. Nurses packed instruments, folded stretchers, and wrote their final entries. "We did what we could," one wrote. "Maybe that's enough." But the story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, American medical teams began preparing for the invasion of Japan, a campaign that never came. Instead, August brought the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by surrender. Many of the same nurses who had treated Japanese prisoners on Okinawa would later serve in occupation hospitals in Tokyo and Yokohama. There, the reversal was complete. American doctors now tended to civilians and soldiers alike, rebuilding a nation through medicine instead of war. For those who had worked through Okinawa, the transition felt surreal. The faces had changed, but the gestures were the same. A bandage tied, a wound cleaned, a life preserved. The nurses who once watched Japanese soldiers cry beneath their care now treated children in bombed cities, applying the same steadiness, the same belief that decency must outlive conflict. The turning point of Okinawa wasn't a flag raised on a hill. It was the moment compassion endured, when every reason existed to abandon it. Under fire, in rain and in grief, the healers of that campaign proved that victory could coexist with mercy. When the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa in June 1945, the island looked like the surface of another world. Entire villages were erased, ridgelines gouged open by artillery, the air thick with the scent of cordite and decay. Yet amid the ruin, order began to return in the same way it had vanished, one careful human gesture at a time. For the medical corps and nurses who had endured the campaign, peace did not mean rest. It meant recovery. The numbers alone told a grim story. Over 200,000 people, soldiers and civilians, had died on Okinawa. Nearly 80,000 were wounded. In the weeks following surrender, American medical teams treated not only Allied casualties, but thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians emerging from the island's caves. Many came out crawling, half-starved, carrying white flags made from shirts. Nurses and corpsmen led them to triage points, offering water before questions. It was the same system that had served under fire, now operating in fragile peace. Army records show that between June and August 1945, more than 7,000 enemy wounded passed through American hospital wards in the Ryukyu Islands. Many of them required long-term care, amputations, burn treatments, and reconstructive surgeries that would continue for months. Others simply needed food and rest. POW camps established near Naha and Yontan included small medical compounds staffed by U.S. doctors and Japanese orderlies. The same nurses who had risked their lives on the battlefield now supervised rehabilitation programs for the men who once swore to die fighting. The tone of the wards changed. The sharp urgency of battle medicine gave way to the slower rhythm of convalescence. Nurses found themselves teaching former enemies how to clean wounds, sterilize instruments, and measure penicillin doses. Some Japanese patients volunteered as assistants, learning rudimentary English words: bandage, pain, thank you. For the Americans, it was a strange reconciliation, performed not in treaties or parades, but through medical charts and shared labor. The transformation extended beyond the wards. Civilian medical relief followed close behind the soldiers. The U.S. Army's Public Health and Welfare Section, formed under General MacArthur's command, began vaccinating Okinawan children against smallpox and distributing antibiotics to villages. Former Army and Navy nurses helped train local women in basic first aid. It was a campaign of healing that ran parallel to the military occupation, a quiet counterpart to the political reconstruction taking place in Tokyo. For many American nurses, leaving Okinawa was emotionally complex. They had treated the worst wounds of the Pacific War, and now they were asked to heal the very people they had fought against. Some confided in journals that the work felt heavier in peace than in battle. There was no adrenaline now, no immediate life-or-death urgency, only the slow realization of what had been lost. The compassion that once defied combat now became the bridge between nations. Japanese patients, too, struggled with the transition. Many viewed their survival as a kind of shame, a visible reminder of surrender. But over time, gratitude replaced guilt. In interviews conducted by Allied intelligence officers, prisoners frequently spoke of their astonishment at being treated with respect. One man recalled being given a cup of coffee and a piece of bread upon arrival at an American field hospital. "I had not tasted kindness since my mother's house," he said quietly. Statements like his circulated through the camp system, softening resistance among holdouts still hiding in caves. As the last graves were filled and the wounded stabilized, the hospitals that had once pulsed with emergency began to dismantle. Cots were folded, instruments packed in crates, and the tents, those fragile sanctuaries of compassion, were struck down one by one. Yet the ethic they represented did not fade. It would travel with the nurses to the next stage of occupation, where Japan itself became a patient in need of reconstruction. The island healed slowly, but the people remembered. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 marked the end of global war, but for the healers of the Pacific, it began a new chapter of quiet endurance. The U.S. occupation forces that arrived in Tokyo and Yokohama carried not only weapons and orders, but also medical supplies, hospital ships, and trained nurses. Their mission had shifted, from treating battlefield wounds to repairing a nation's body and conscience. American medical teams established hospitals in former Imperial Army facilities, clearing rubble and disinfecting wards that had once treated Japanese soldiers. Disease, hunger, and homelessness now replaced artillery as the great enemies. Typhus and tuberculosis swept through the ruined cities. Food scarcity weakened millions. The Army Medical Corps, with support from the Red Cross and the newly formed Public Health and Welfare Section, deployed across Japan to restore sanitation, distribute penicillin, and train local medical personnel. Many of the same nurses who had served on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa now found themselves walking the streets of a defeated Tokyo, tending to civilians instead of combatants. They treated malnourished children in makeshift clinics, vaccinated factory workers, and visited bombed neighborhoods where families lived under collapsed roofs. The Japanese population, accustomed to wartime propaganda that had painted Americans as demons, often greeted them in silence, until the first act of care shattered disbelief. A simple injection, a blanket, a kind word through an interpreter carried the same quiet power as it had in the tents of Okinawa. The transition from war to peace reshaped both sides. For the Americans, it was the ultimate test of their wartime ethics, proving that compassion shown to prisoners had not been situational, but foundational. For the Japanese, it revealed that surrender was not annihilation. The same hands that had destroyed cities were now saving children from disease. Slowly, trust replaced terror. In 1946, formal reports from the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, ESCAP, noted dramatic improvements in Japan's health metrics. Mortality rates from infectious disease dropped by more than half. Japanese nurses, trained by their American counterparts, began staffing civilian hospitals rebuilt under occupation authority. Many later acknowledged that the presence of American women, uniformed, disciplined, and unflinching, challenged their old perceptions of gender, power, and nationhood. The image of the nurse, once associated only with imperial duty, evolved into a symbol of post-war modernity. The humanitarian success of the occupation's medical mission had far-reaching consequences. It strengthened America's moral position in the new global order and laid groundwork for the 1949 revision of the Geneva Conventions, which reinforced the neutrality of medical personnel and the protection of civilians. The lessons learned in the Pacific, where mercy had proven stronger than hatred, became written law. For the nurses who returned home, the memories lingered. Many could never forget the faces of the men they treated, both American and Japanese. Some kept photographs of the wards or fragments of the canvas tents that had sheltered them. In interviews decades later, they rarely spoke of glory or victory. They spoke of rain, exhaustion, and the moment a wounded soldier, once the enemy, reached for their hand. That, one veteran nurse said, was when I understood what the war had taught us, to be human again. The compassion displayed in the Pacific did more than heal bodies. It became a moral blueprint for how nations could emerge from catastrophe. Through antiseptic and silence, through fatigue and perseverance, the nurses and medics who crossed from battle into peace demonstrated that civilization endures not through power, but through the refusal to abandon mercy. And so, as Japan rebuilt and the world entered a precarious peace, the memory of those wartime healers endured, proof that amid humanity's darkest chapters there had still been light. In the final count, the story of American nurses and Japanese soldiers is not about victory or defeat. It is about what survived between them. The guns of Okinawa have long fallen silent, their echoes buried under concrete and time. Yet the echo of compassion still lingers. History often records war in terms of strategy, divisions, and armaments, but it rarely pauses to measure the quiet defiance of those who chose to heal instead of harm. On the battlefield, mercy was not an ideal. It was an act of will. Every nurse who stepped into a mud-soaked tent knew that compassion carried a cost: fatigue, grief, and sometimes ridicule. But their persistence proved something that weapons never could, that humanity, once awakened, refuses to vanish. When Japanese prisoners wept at the sight of kindness, they weren't merely reacting to comfort. They were confronting the shattering realization that their enemy had remained human. The nurses, too, carried scars invisible to history books. They witnessed pain on a scale that could have hardened any heart, yet they chose the opposite path. In doing so, they redefined what moral strength looked like. They showed that decency under fire was not weakness. It was civilization's last defense. Their tents became small, glowing sanctuaries in a world collapsing under hatred. From those canvas walls flowed lessons that outlasted the war. That power untempered by mercy corrodes itself, and that compassion, extended even to the fallen, becomes a bridge across centuries. The post-war healing of Japan, its hospitals rebuilt, its children vaccinated, its people restored, was rooted in those first, fragile gestures of empathy on distant islands. Today, when historians revisit the Pacific War, they find in its vast brutality small moments of light, moments where one human being refused to let the war decide what kind of person they would be. The nurses who knelt beside Japanese soldiers did more than tend wounds. They proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, the capacity to care can survive the storm. And in that endurance lies the quiet, enduring victory, one written not in triumphal headlines, but in mercy's steady, unshakable hand.